Okay, go live. So, good evening. Every single time. Pam's got the right idea. Good evening. There we go. Thank you. Much better. You'll all get sick of me saying this, but we have to do it at the beginning of every program, otherwise there will be an offender. But please do silence your cell phones now. A few program announcements before we get started. Next Thursday, December 16th at 7 p.m., Dr. Joe Laker, who's here with us tonight, Emeritus Professor of History at Wheeling Jesuit University, will take over the teaching duties. For Class 3, that's going to be the Fall of Empires. That's next Thursday, December 16th at 7 p.m. The following class is not on a Thursday, it's on a Tuesday. That's December 21st at 7 p.m. Dr. Hal Gorby, current professor of history at WVU, will be with us. He will lead Class 4, the Second Red Scare. That's going to cover McCarthyism and some local occurrences. That same day, December 21st at noon, at Lunch with Books, our daytime program, we will have our holiday program with Don Feenerty. He's going to give us the second annual Simple Life Holiday Special. These programs are based on the Foxfire books that were compiled by Wheeling native Elliot Wigington. Fairmain, who does traditional English and Scotch-Irish music, will be here as musical guests for that program. So that's December 21st at noon at Lunch with Books. And then 1 week earlier, Tuesday, December 14th, that's this coming Tuesday, we're going to celebrate the 230th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. It was ratified the following day, December 15th, 1791. Dr. Mary, I have to do this every time, I want to call her Mary Ann, but her name is Anne Marie Lafoso, is a professor of law at West Virginia University, and she'll be joining us to talk about the Bill of Rights that day. That's Tuesday, December 14th at noon. And some of you might remember that she was also a People's University instructor. We got a comment online last week when we announced that. They said how wonderful she was. And if you don't believe that comment, you can go online and watch that because they were all broadcast and are on our website as well. You can just look for the women's rights, just do a search for women's rights and it'll pop up the live stream broadcast of that. Tonight's instructor is Dr. Gary Campbell. Those of you who were here last week know what an excellent presenter he is. He's the Emeritus Professor of History. He spent his entire professional career serving the students and his colleagues at his alma mater, Bethany College. In addition to teaching courses in world history, European history, military history, and the history of ideas, for many years he taught first-year seminars on the Cold War and on the history of Bethany College. He earned his BA at Bethany and his MA and PhD at West Virginia University. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Gary Cavill.
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you all for coming out again. It's a real vote of confidence that after last week you showed up again. So I'll take that as a compliment and that sort of thing. Tonight we're going to try to get a little bit farther than we did last time. You will recall that the purpose of my first presentation last week was to look at the roots of the Cold War and to try to get a handle on some of the issues that would lead to terms that we came to identify with the Cold War, above all containment, but also, as we'll see this evening, NATO. And thank you, Mr. Putin, for bringing that up yesterday. And the idea that indeed much of what we learned or we experienced in the Cold War of the 1940s and 50s seems to be coming around again. And not only with our former adversaries, the Soviets, but even more so with the Chinese. And we have people tossing these terms and ideas from the Cold War around as though they're new, or that in some cases we didn't really learn any of the lessons of that past. Very briefly, to recap for those of you who weren't here last time, we looked at the origins of the war, of the Cold War, in the war against Nazism, because it was, after all, the German invasion of Russia in June of 1941 that set off a train of events which would eventually bring the Red Army into the heart of Europe. And we mentioned, of course, it wasn't the first time. In 1814, there was a Russian army in Paris. And people were scared of that too. But once the Allies began to exert their influence, their force against Nazi Germany, the defeat of Germany became inevitable. And that inevitably led to the expansion of Russian power into the heart of Central Europe. That's simply the way the war was going to unfold. During the war itself, there were a number of agreements made either face-to-face at the great Big Three talks, above all, the most successful of them, Tehran in November of 1943, Yalta in February of 1945, and Potsdam in July of 1945. Each one somewhat less successful than the previous one because, of course, it was Adolf Hitler and the Nazis that were the cement holding this rather strange alliance of Western democracies and an Eastern totalitarian state, Western capitalist states and an Eastern socialist state together. And as their common enemy gradually disappeared, the fundamental differences in their worldviews began to reemerge. And indeed, it was not unexpected. Stalin himself had said, look, at the end of the war, each side will impose its own system on those territories occupied by their armies. Whether the Americans believed that or not, when he said it, it seemed to be pretty obvious to Stalin. And indeed, in the West, first the Italians, and then as after D-Day, the Allied army swept across Europe toward the Rhine, and the Netherlands, Belgium, France were liberated. Those territories all came back under the governments that they had had prior to the war. It just so happened to be most parliamentary democracies and that sort of thing. In the East, the Red Army was organizing governments in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, Bulgaria. Not in Yugoslavia, however, because the Yugoslavs had managed to liberate themselves from the Germans under the leadership of a communist, Joseph Broz, whose war name was Tito, and who was alone among the Eastern European leaders, a genuine national hero. He had led the resistance to the Nazis, and so with that nationalist pull, he was an oddball, and as we'll see, this could cause a problem for Stalin. Immediately the war was over. All of Germany was occupied. It had been divided into zones: the British in the north, Americans in the south, the Russians in the east, the French sort of wedged in there at Churchill's insistence. More importantly, the city of Berlin itself, 100 miles inside the eastern zone, had also been divided. This was to symbolize the wartime cooperation of the victorious Allies. Now, nobody expected this system to last very long, only until the peace conference. Well, there never was a peace conference. And so by the end of 1946 and into 1947, as we saw the other day, the situation was beginning to, those lines of, those zones of occupation were really hardening into frontiers. Between the three Western zones, which were combined into first Bizonia and then Trizonia by the British, the French, and the Americans, and the Eastern zone itself. Meanwhile, in March 1946, Churchill had talked about the fall of an iron curtain across the face of Europe, from that's the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An iron curtain has fallen across Central Europe, behind which lie all the capitals of Central Europe. By the end of 1945, things were really not looking very good. There was the Foreign Ministers' Conference in Moscow. It was the last major face-to-face meeting, and nothing came out of it. Reparations question, what to do about Germany, what to do about the Polish government. All of these things that had been bandied about were left completely unsettled, and both sides began to settle in to developing their own or implementing their own views for the future in these areas. We mentioned that the Russians actually did conduct elections in the East in several countries, and in Czechoslovakia, the communists won 30% of the vote and were welcomed into the government. In Bulgaria and Romania, however, they did not do well, and that the Russians drew the lesson from that is we don't like elections, or at least not ones that are even reasonably open. On the other hand, there was no attempt to Sovietize those states, to turn them into little Soviet unions at this time, if for no other reason, there simply weren't enough communists around to do it. And so for the first couple of years after the end of the war, the countries of Eastern Europe were not turned into communist dictatorships. We were still trying to sort that kind of thing out. The X article from George F. Kennan in the spring of 1947 tried to explain to the American people and to the American government the sources of Soviet conduct. He said, of course, ideology and circumstance. They are communists. They view everything through the Marxist lens. But they are also creatures of circumstance, how they came to power in revolution in a country like Russia, which has, let's face it, we in America, we tend to forget this sometimes. And this, talk about fitting right into what happened yesterday with Mr. Biden and Mr. Putin's discussion. What is the Russian demand? That NATO not be expanded into Ukraine. Why? There is a deep-seated insecurity in the Russian national character. Now, I know some people don't believe in national characters and so on, and might be dated scholarship. I believe that it's true. And certainly, when you look at the history of Russia, they have no defensible borders, either in the East or the West. And over the centuries, they have been repeatedly invaded. We haven't had that. We have not had foreign troops on our soil for 200 years. Well, okay, the Aleutians. But really since the War of 1812. So Americans don't really understand that kind of insecurity. The Russians have been invaded from both the East and the West repeatedly. The Mongol period for 200 years. Then, after that was gone, first the Poles, then the Swedes, then the French, then the Germans, twice in the 20th century, have all invaded from the West. So when the Red Army occupied that whole Eastern European glacis, you'll recall we said Stalin had a choice. He now had a defensive perimeter stretching outward away from the heartland of Russia, but the Americans wouldn't give him any aid to help rebuild his country if he didn't go back into his own borders. So he had to choose between what he saw as security or assistance, and he chose security. And that in turn, as Kennan pointed out, meant that it would be some time before we could have any serious hope that the Soviet Union would mellow, I guess is a better term, the best term I can think of, and that what we had to do as the most powerful country in the world in the West was simply be patient and meet the Russians at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points to contain their ambitions, but also to express to them the fact that we weren't going anywhere, and we also accept that you aren't going anywhere. There was nothing offensive in the doctrine of containment. Indeed, that's how people who don't like it will attack it, as we'll see in a few minutes. There wasn't anything offensive about the doctrine of containment. It was purely defensive. When the X article was published in the spring of 1947, two quick events gave us the outline of that. First, the Truman Doctrine. The idea that the United States would provide assistance to any country that could demonstrate that it was currently facing, subversion or a threat of invasion by an outside power. And this will become the military arm of the doctrine of containment. The second was the Marshall Plan. There were areas, Western Europe, where the military threat was not there. The threat was the fact that the economies of Western Europe were not recovering, and the communists were winning elections, especially in Italy and in France. And so the Marshall Plan was designed to rebuild Europe, and it was all of Europe. Marshall insisted that the Marshall Plan as a plan be offered to all Europeans, including the Russians and their satellites in Eastern Europe. The Russians declined that offer, and as I mentioned, probably the biggest mistake they ever made. If they had insisted on being part of the Marshall Plan would never have gotten through the American Senate under any circumstances. But these two halves of the same walnut, if you will, then became the backbone of the doctrine of containment. And so by the end of 1947, we are beginning to dig in our heels. Senator Vandenberg had told Truman, look, you're going to have to scare hell out of the American people to get them to back this kind of thing. We just won the biggest war in history. And what was the tradition in the United States at the end of a war? What do? You go home, exactly. You demobilize, and we were demobilizing. You go back to having kids and having 2 cars in every garage and a chicken in every pot. And after all, we had nuclear weapons, right? The Russians didn't. And there were those who said, look, let's put that thing on our hip like a 6-shooter, they can go out in there like high noon and just tell the Russians where to get on and where to get off. Well, Truman tried that. Of course, it didn't work. Stalin himself said, look, the bomb is simply a toy to threaten people who have weak nerves. And in fact, as we'll see, it was precisely that period between 1945 and 1949 when the Russians didn't have a nuclear weapon that they did, in fact, ultimately totally Sovietize the Eastern European states and kick out anybody who had any popular standing within any of the countries in Eastern Europe. The one guy they didn't get away with it, however, was Tito. They tried it, but Tito was one step ahead of them. The first thing he did was round up all the Muscovites within his own Communist Party and have them shot. Stalin said, I will shake my little finger and Tito will go away. Well, he didn't. And there are lots of reasons for that. But the underlying reason, actually, for this was that Tito dared to defy Stalin's leadership of the world communist movement. And Stalin simply could not allow that. But Tito didn't have any Red Army troops on his soil, and he had a coastline, which allowed the West to get to him. And that happened in 1948. And Titoism became the great bugbear for Stalin. That's when the real Sovietization of Eastern Europe took place. Within a year, there were no communist leaders in Eastern Europe who had any even remotely popular standing with their people. They were in power solely because the Red Army was there. And that was very clear. Many of these men had been shot or put away. Emre Nagy in Hungary was put in prison, Ladislav Gomulka in Poland, that sort of thing. 1948 was not a good year for Stalin, because not only was this happening on his side of the Iron Curtain, but what's happening on the West, in the Western side. By the beginning of 1948, the British, French, and the Americans had created, as we mentioned, Trizonia, and clearly were planning to build their own German state. And Germany, you'll recall, is the brass ring of the early Cold War. The Cold War began in Europe, and control of Germany was the key. And if one side couldn't control all of it, then it was better to leave it divided. And as we mentioned, that was fine with everybody in Europe too, except the Germans. The famous French remark, I love Germany. I thank God there are 2 of them. That sort of thing. But Stalin saw that the Western allies were rebuilding Germany. And this is the man whose country had suffered enormously and was way behind in terms of economic recovery and so on. And so he looked around to try to find something to force the Western democracies to stop this campaign to create a separate Germany, which would become the cat's paw of Western capitalism, that sort of thing. And so in June of 1948, he took what many people considered to be gave us the first real face-to-face test between the East and West. And that was, he cut off all land access to those 3 zones in Western Berlin. Now, you may find this hard to believe, but in fact, the Allies had no legal right to land access to their zones in Berlin. Why? Because nobody thought, for one thing, it would be necessary in 1944 and 1945 when these things were being hashed out. And number 2, nobody believed they'd still be there 3 years after the war. And so Stalin was completely within his rights. And that's why he chose it. That's why he chose to do that. Well, what would be the Western response? Lucius Clay, the American commander in the West, wanted to load up a couple of armored trains and ram them down the throats of the Russians to see what they do. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed. And something was discovered. We didn't have land access rights, but we did have air access rights. Why? Because somebody back in 1944 looked around and said, you know, a whole bunch of airplanes flying into one city with an airfield in each of the 4 zones, that might get a little dangerous. And so let's set up specific corridors for each of the 4 powers by treaty or by arrangement. And so the Western Allies actually had legal access for airlift, to airlift supplies. Now, Berlin had more than 1 million people. Nobody had ever tried to supply that many people by air before, but the Americans were up to it. Of course, it's the kind of challenge Americans loved. You know, it's technology and that kind of thing. And sure enough, by the spring of 1949, the Americans and their allies were flying 13,000 tons of supplies into Berlin every day. You know what the biggest single thing was? Coal, to keep the power plants going. That sort of thing. And so Stalin was now checkmated on his own game, because if he shot down one of those planes, he would have been in direct violation of the agreements that he himself had signed. Meanwhile, as we mentioned, the Tito issue blew up in his face. And so by the end of 1948, the beginning of 1949, things were not looking too well for Stalin in Europe. But it is also at that moment that the Cold War began to shift to a truly global scale with the defeat of the nationalist Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek in China. Mao Zedong and the communists had fought a civil war with the nationalists going all the way back to the 1930s. And it sort of temporarily in advance during the war. After the war, Chiang Kai-shek tried to use all the American aid he had received during the war. Roosevelt had been a big backer of Chiang, and tried to win a military victory. He failed. And indeed, he and his forces were driven off into the island of Taiwan. And again, just look at the headlines today. That sort of thing. And the question was, how long before the Red Chinese, as we called them, would take over Taiwan as well. But now the world's most populous country had fallen under communist control. And in the West, it was viewed as a disaster. Here in the United States, the question of who lost China became a major political issue, and in fact will affect our policies throughout Asia going forward, because the first thing that happened was that everyone in the State Department's Far East desk was accused of being communist. Even George C. Marshall, the man who had won the war more than Ike, was accused of being a communist at one point because we had not sufficiently supported Chiang. The result was that the State Department, essentially, the Eastern Division, simply blew its own brains out. And when the time came for us to deal with Korea, and especially Vietnam, There weren't very many people in the American State Department that had any experience in the Far East who could provide us with the kind of detailed knowledge of these areas of the world. And so the who lost China debate here in the United States not only will feed into the McCarthy period, but it also will have an effect on our policies going forward for some time. And you can imagine what the alarm in the West was of all of this. And so by the beginning of 1949, with the Berlin blockade still in place, the Berlin airlift still going on, the Europeans decided that they needed assurances that the Americans would stick around. And indeed, the Americans increasingly were willing to give those kinds of assurances, but how? Well, the formula turned out to be something called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The United States had never entered into a peacetime alliance with any country in the world dealing with security matters. Friends with everyone, allies with none. Remember George Washington's beware entangling alliances, all of that sort of thing. Here we were in the spring of 1949, joining an organization, indeed designing an organization, in which the United States pledged its sacred honor to the defense of other countries for the first time. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization Charter, the key clause is Article 5, which says that an attack on any member of the alliance will be considered an attack on all members of the alliance and requires a collective response of all the members. It's only been invoked once, by the way. Anybody know when? Exactly, Afghanistan. The United States is the only country that has ever benefited from Article 5 of the NATO treaty. When Dean Acheson was trying to sell the treaty, the idea of the treaty to the Senate, people said, well, is this going to be where we're going to have more alliance systems and so on? Acheson said, no, this is the only one. Don't worry, fellas. We're not going to have this string of alliances. Well, guess what happened in the 1950s? We had a string of alliances, right? We had NATO, then we had CENTO, which was the Baghdad Pact, which became CENTO. Then we had CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Indeed, a whole series of them, all part of this increasing notion of containment. Okay? This idea that we can build a barrier around the Soviet Union and now China and contain, their power. By the summer of 1949, Stalin realized that he couldn't stop the formation of West Germany. In fact, May 1st, 1949, the Federal Republic became a state, recognized, of course, only by the Western powers. By the end of that month, Stalin called off the blockade. People, as I say, some people think, why did he do this? At least he did it where he could control it. If Lucius Clay had, in fact, gotten his way and rammed those trains down his throat, he could always have backed off. He wasn't ready for a war. But on the other hand, he had 1.5 million ground troops in Eastern Europe compared to a pitiful amount of troops in the West. The Americans had their nuclear weapons. They moved a squadron of B-29s to England at the beginning of the crisis. Didn't have any bombs, though. Oops. There was a lag in our development and that sort of thing. So Stalin had called off the Berlin blockade in the summer of 1949. But now he's faced with an alliance which has committed the United States to the defense of Europe and part of this containment process. Then came the next, Stalin's next little move. In August of 1949, American scientists detected unmistakable signs that the Soviets had tested their own atomic bomb only 4 years after Hiroshima. There had been those in this country who said it would take them 20 years, 10 years, whatever. They did it in 4. Now, they had some help from espionage, but not that much. And indeed, the science of the thing is pretty straightforward. The physics is very straightforward. We'll talk about that during Christmas week, and peace on earth and all that good stuff. About the bombs, more bombs, bigger bombs, better bombs on the 30th, if you'd like to come back, and that sort of thing. But always remember, from this point forward, in the back of the Cold War, hovering over the shoulder of all participants, is increasingly the threat of nuclear destruction on both sides. Now, initially, the Russians didn't have a delivery vehicle that could get their bombs to the United States. We had military bases ringing the whole of the Soviet frontiers, and so we could bomb them. But the Russians could bomb Western Europe and that sort of thing. And from August 1949, the nuclear standoff had begun. It also caused the Americans to consider their situation or reconsider their situation. Containment was one thing, but there were those in the State Department who believed that containment was not enough. It was purely defensive in character, and now that the Russians had nuclear weapons, we needed a far more robust, offensive plan for the Cold War. And throughout the winter of 1949 and into the spring of 1950, a group of men in the State Department, led by Paul Nitze and Dean Acheson, hashed out something that became known as NSC 68, National Security Council Document 68. In the spring of 1950, they presented it to Harry Truman, and it was a truly revolutionary document in terms of the traditions of the United States. It called for, among other things, a tripling of the United States defense budget from $14 billion to $40 billion. We just approved one 2 days ago for $750 billion. So I know there's been inflation, but still, that sort of thing. That we should develop a new bomb, the super bomb, a hydrogen weapon, as opposed to an atomic weapon. A rapid buildup of our conventional forces so we wouldn't have to use those weapons unless the Russians used them themselves. A large increase in taxes to pay for this sort of thing. Mobilize American society for the sacrifice. Remember, Truman had scared hell out of the American people in order to get the Truman Doctrine through. Well, we're really going to have to scare the hell out of them now. And most importantly, not simply sit back and wait for the Soviets to mellow, as Kenman's doctrine of containment seemed to imply. No, we want to go on the offensive. It became known as rollback. Okay? That leaving people under the rule of godless atheistic communists was the coward's way out. And so we had to build up a military machine that would be capable of taking offensive action when and where the opportunity presented itself. George F. Kennan fought against it. He said, that's not what I said in that article. Chip Bolin, Charles Bolin also supported him. Both of them were silenced. As a matter of fact, within a year, they were both out of the State Department. In April of 1950, it was presented to Truman, who initially was lukewarm on many of the provisions. But then in June of 1950, June 25th, 1950, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. And Truman was convinced. Indeed, Korea provided the political cover for the Americans to implement the doctrines that were laid out in NSC 68, and which were to direct or to influence our policies right on through the 1970s and into the 1980s. In fact, in parts of it are still there. That sort of thing. But NSC 68 becomes the blueprint for the American side in the Cold War. It also provides the impetus for the rise of what a future president at the time, Ike Eisenhower, will call the military-industrial complex. The large-scale expenditures on military hardware and maintaining massive forces stationed throughout the world. Again, completely in opposition to the traditions of the United States prior to that time. The Korean imbroglio was kind of an interesting one. Nobody's really sure to this day exactly who gave the green light to Kim Il-sung, the leader of the North Korea. Korea had been divided at the 38th parallel in 1945. Again, strictly for administrative purposes, the Russians were to disarm the Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel, and the Western forces were to disarm the Japanese south of the 38th parallel. 38th parallel was not to be considered a frontier. This was purely a practical move, again, awaiting a peace treaty. Well, there never was a peace treaty in the Pacific either, at least not as far as the Russians are concerned. There was one between the United States and Japan, but the Russians, you'll recall, had been frozen completely out of the occupation of Japan by the Americans, and that sort of thing. And so in the northern part of Korea, just as Stalin had prophesied, thoroughly socializing and communizing the state. In the south, the Korean state was being built on the basis of parliamentary democracy, but its leader, Syngman Rhee, was not exactly the kind of democrat that most of us would recognize. Indeed, long before the invasion of South Korea, there was a fair amount of fighting in the southern part of the country. Thousands of people were killed as Syngman Rhee attempted to impose his authority on these states. But as I say, nobody really knows exactly who gave Kim Il-sung the green light. It certainly wasn't the Russians, because Truman immediately went to the Security Council and asked for their support. Remember the Security Council, where 5 great powers had a veto? Guess who wasn't there? The Russians. They had been boycotting ever since the spring. Why? Because we refused to give China's permanent seat, which had been given to Chiang Kai-shek at Roosevelt's insistence, to the Red Chinese. And so the Russians were boycotting, so they weren't there to cast their veto, which suggests that Kim Il-sung probably caught Moscow by surprise as well. The North Korean armies moved south very quickly. Truman took a series of actions. He committed American air and naval units, and then after that wasn't enough, he began to commit American ground units under the auspices of the United Nations. Eventually, more than 20 United Nations countries will contribute something to the operations. But it was touch and go for a little while. The UN forces, mostly American and South Korean, were driven back to Pusan perimeter, the southern tip of the peninsula. Then in September 1950, MacArthur launches his surprise assault at Incheon, cutting off the North Koreans, and it's off to the Yalu. Okay. Originally, the Americans said, we're not interested in reunifying Korea. We just want to get the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel. Then all of a sudden it became a war to unify Korea. Many people in the West, however, thought it was a feint. There were those who said, this is Stalin stirring up things in the East, and he's getting ready to move where? In the West. Because remember, Europe was still the heart of the Cold War in 1950. And many people believed that the Korean gambit was simply a distraction. But in fact, it gave, as we said, Truman the cover that he needed to implement NSC 68, a vast expansion of American military power, the development of the military-industrial complex to support it, and after some back and forth, it appeared as though MacArthur was about to be successful and unify North Korea. The Chinese were furious as the UN troops advanced northwards toward the Yalu, the border between China and Korea. The Chinese tried to send a message through Pakistan that don't come to our border. Whether they were encouraged in this by Stalin, we don't know either. What we do know is that Stalin was more worried about China than he was about us. Okay, if he was worried about Tito being an independent communist leader, how about the guy who's in charge of the world's largest country? And the Sino-Soviet split really dates from this period. Stalin always kept the Chinese communists at arm's length. We didn't see it that way. We saw it as a monolithic communist bloc, that sort of thing. But in late November 1950, the Chinese entered the war. They drove the UN forces back below the 38th parallel. They in turn were driven back above the 38th parallel. And Truman was faced with a serious question about, are we going to fight not only now the Koreans, but also the world's largest country, or are we going to fight to restore the status quo ante? In other words, are we simply going to fight to maintain the containment barrier? And that was the decision that he made. He made it in the teeth of opposition from many people here in the United States and by his own chief commander, Douglas MacArthur, indeed to the point where Truman was forced to fire him to assert, once again, civilian leadership over the military. It's the White House that sets policy. It's the Pentagon that carries it out. That had been the tradition in the United States, although in recent times it's been a little kind of interesting to see how some of that's flipped around. Well, by the summer of 1951, as you know, the war had come to a stalemate. Peace talks were opened, and they were to drag on for 2 years until an armistice was finally achieved, and it is still in place. The Korean War technically is still going on. There has been no peace. There's been no peace agreement, no peace treaty ending the Korean War. It's one of the reasons we still have several tens of thousands of troops in South Korea. But Korea gave the Truman administration the cover that it needed and really fired up the anti-communist sentiments here in the United States. They were already there, but the Korean War really turned that up, turned up the flame, if you will. As I mentioned, the United States continued to develop the hydrogen bomb, tested one in 1952. The Russians then tested theirs in 1953. And these bombs were of a completely different magnitude. And so the arms race, again, over the shoulder of all of the Cold War. You have to remember that any direct fighting between the United States and the Russians might well end in nuclear disaster. American troops were fighting and dying in Korea, 35,000 of them, but they weren't fighting Russian troops. Later, Russians will fight other people, but not Americans. Americans will fight Vietnamese. That was part of the game of the Cold War. No direct military engagement between the two central powers, the two powers at the core of the East and Western Alliance. Despite all the rhetoric, Stalin himself died in March of 1953. Some people argue this is why the Koreans finally came to an armistice agreement, the armistice that summer, that sort of thing. And as is normal in totalitarian regimes, the succession question then raised its head. Who would be Stalin's successor? And until that was determined, the Russians, just like, as I say, it normally happens, they pulled in their foreign policy horns for a little while until they could sort out the succession question. There were several possible choices. Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, Nikolai Kaganovich, Molotov, and the head of the KGB, a man named Lavrentiy Beria. The other guys got together immediately and said, look, if we don't get rid of him, he'll get rid of all of us one at a time. And so Beria was eliminated. He came to the meeting of the Central Committee or the Politburo one morning and was escorted over to Lubyanka prison, which is across the street from the Kremlin, and no one ever saw him again. He was executed. And over the next couple of years, Kaganovich, Khrushchev Malenkov jockeyed for position. And one of the things that they used was policy towards the West, policy in the Cold War. So, for example, in 1955, you'll recall that Austria, even though she was technically considered a liberated country, in other words, she'd been a victim of Nazi aggression, she had been divided into occupation zones. And Khrushchev, and in a bid to become sort of the first among equals, pushed a policy of settling the Austrian question by offering the Austrians a deal. Maintain strict neutrality between East and West, and you can have your independence back. The Austrians jumped at it. Obviously, it was a ploy to suggest to the West Germans, who were now thoroughly integrated into the Western Alliance. In fact, in that same year, 1955, the Bundeswehr was created. We now had a German army just 10 years after the end of the last war. We are now arming a huge German. And by the way, the French were not happy. And that sort of thing. And then in 1956, February, at the party conference, Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech, 4-hour speech, didn't stay secret for very long, in which he denounced the crimes of Stalin and all of the terrible things that Stalin had done. At one point, and of course Khrushchev and all of these guys, they had come up. The reason they were at the top was that all the guys above them had been shot in the purges. And while Khrushchev was at the microphone, somebody passed a piece of paper up and said, "Why didn't you tell us this before?" And he held it up and he said, "Who wrote this?" And nobody raised his hand because, of course, Khrushchev said, "You have your answer." Okay, but he was willing to try to come to some kind of arrangement with the West. Indeed, he began to talk about something later called peaceful coexistence. At the same time, the Chinese, under Mao Zedong, who were demanding ever more forceful opposition to the West. Okay, the West were imperialist paper taggers. And now that the Russians had nuclear weapons and they had thermonuclear weapons, and after Sputnik in October of 1957, they had ICBMs, why don't we take these people on? Khrushchev tried to say, look, are you crazy? They have thousands of weapons as well. We didn't have any ICBMs, at least initially, but we had weapons in Turkey, and we had weapons in Italy, and we had SAC, the Strategic Air Command, with hundreds and hundreds of bombers, carrying nuclear weapons. And so Khrushchev at least realized the Americans were not such paper taggers. In October of 1956, what's the word I want here? Well, let's say that question of rollback, okay, which had been sold as part of NSC 68 and which had been pushed by John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. Rollback. We cannot allow people to continue to live under godless atheistic communism if we can help it. Well, in October of 1956, the people of Hungary took us at our word, and they rose up against the Russians. The Poles had already, after Stalin's after Khrushchev's de-Stalinization speech, that set ripples throughout because all these countries had been Stalinized. Okay, the Poles were the first. They brought Gomulka out of prison and put him back in power, but the Hungarians went farther. They demanded that they be allowed to leave. The Soviets had set up the Warsaw Pact as their answer to NATO, and they said, we want out. We want to be neutral. And they called upon the West to come and help them. And we did nothing. And Radio Budapest pleaded with the West as the Russian tanks were coming back into the city and crushing the Hungarian Revolution. Before the Russians were able to close the border between Hungary and Austria, almost 10% of the Hungarian population fled into Austria. and rollback was exposed as a fake. And it was clear now that whatever the Russians did on their side of the Iron Curtain was their business. And likewise, what we did on our side of the Iron Curtain was our business. It was one of those come to Jesus moments where people didn't come to Jesus in the West. After that, who could really believe any rhetoric about rollback or about liberation or that sort of thing? Not that we didn't continue to try, continue to speak in those terms, and to speak in terms of the defense of freedom against the expansion of communism. And of course, as you know, the next major testing ground, of course, would be Southeast Asia. As we mentioned, after the Who Lost China debate, there weren't very many people in the American State Department who knew much about Southeast Asia. And in any event, we had, in 1950, that was a French problem. The French were trying to reestablish their colonial empire in French Indochina. By 1951, the United States was providing almost 90% of the financial assistance to the French to fight that war. The French said, look, we're fighting the same war here in Vietnam that you're fighting in Korea. And we need our help. And look, you want a German army? Our whole army is in Southeast Asia. So if you want a German army, then you better help us out. And that was the deal at the time, that sort of thing. Well, as you know, the French attempt to reestablish their authority ended in disaster. After Dien Bien Phu in the spring of 1954, the French government finally threw up its hands and said, we're out. Negotiation was carried out in Geneva, in which the United States refused to participate. The United States instead sent only observers to the treaty or to the talks, and felt then that they were not bound in any way by the terms of the agreements that the French and the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh had come to. Among other things, the division of Viet Nam at the 17th parallel, above which Ho Chi Minh and the boys would reorganize, and below which the French and their colonial allies would reorganize. But again, the 17th parallel was specifically said this will not become a national frontier. It wasn't set up as a border. National elections were to be held within 2 years. The French left. The Americans increasingly became to support the government in Saigon. And when the time came for the election, it was pretty clear that Ho Chi Minh would win in a walk. Oh, shoot. This is what happens when you get old. Pentagon Papers. Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg said, if Ho Chi Minh dead could have beaten anybody we put up. That sort of thing. And so the United States encouraged him to not hold elections, to undermine them. And in fact, they were never held. And by 1960, the United States, MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, had a massive operation in Saigon, several thousand American advisors, money being poured in, on the argument that we had lost the northern part of Vietnam, but we could save the southern part. This was all part of something that came to be known as the Domino Theory, that if we let one of these countries fall to communist thing, everyone else will fall just like a string of dominoes. Excuse me, that sort of thing. And while this was happening in the late 1950s, as we mentioned, the two sides were building large numbers of nuclear weapons. The Gaither Commission in 1958 discovered that the Americans had no overarching plan to how to use their nuclear weapons. And when they went to talk to Curtis LeMay, the head of SAC, to make sure that the weapons would be under the command of the civilian authority, Curtis LeMay told them, look, my intelligence is so good that if when the Russians get ready to hit us, I will know a week in advance. And forgive my language, but this is what he said. When I see that, I'm going to kick the shit out of them. He said, well, General, that's not the policy of the United States. He said, I don't care. It's my policy, and that's what I'm going to do. And so eventually we'll get something called PSYOP, the whole question of national command authority, and that sort of thing. So the Cold War had gotten hot twice now in Korea and was getting hot in Southeast Asia. In the early 1960s, it got hotter much closer to home. And that was, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. In 1959, Cuba had come under a communist, well, he wasn't a communist at the time, communist leadership under Castro, that sort of thing. We didn't like it. He began to nationalize stuff. And the Eisenhower administration began to explore possibilities of how to deal with this. Well, it just so happens, of course, that in 1953, we had overthrown a government in Iran with the CIA. And in 1954, we had overthrown a government in Guatemala, again, with help from the CIA. And who was the head of the CIA? Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles was the brother of Ike's foreign minister, Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, although he was now no longer there in office. And so the question was, well, sure, we can deal with this, just as we've dealt with it elsewhere. NSC 68 had put us into a position where this kind of activity of the subversion of the governments of other states was now considered fair play. The Truman Doctrine had put us on the side of some pretty unsavory characters. Kind of reminded the old Roosevelt thing. He may be a son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. Okay? By the 1960s, we were in bed with some pretty bad sons of bitches because they were anti-communists. And Kennan's plea at the end of his article, which you'll recall, all we really have to do to win this battle, win this war, you can call it war, but win this struggle with the Soviets is to live up to our own best ideals. And the 1950s demonstrated that that part of the X article had been forgotten, and that the doctrine of containment had been militarized by NSC 68. And thus, as we moved into the 1960s, the showdown between East and West now was truly global. No part of the world was immune from it. And as Dr. Laker, I'm sure, will talk next week, many of the independence struggles in Africa and in Asia, obviously, got caught up in the Cold War. And the Americans backing one side, the Russians backing the other side. And it will become really quite difficult sometimes to tell the players without a scorecard. Okay, thank you so much. I'll leave it there for today. Yes, sir.
Do you think the defeat of training Kashek was inevitable? So why?
Okay, I'll say yes. And because of Barbara Tuchman. If you have never read Stilwell and the American Experience in China, I think once you read that book, you'll understand that the nationalist government was not a government. It was a kleptocracy. And it had very little popular support. Whereas the communists, whatever you may think of them, and you can think some pretty bad things, and Mao was responsible for the death of millions of people eventually, when he was in a position to do so. They had studiously cultivated the peasantry, who for millennia had been on the short end of the stick in China. And so at the end of World War II, the Chinese communists were well positioned to expand outward and to carry hope of a new China. And they had the record to back it up. Whereas Chiang Kai-shek's government was essentially made up of upper middle class businessmen the top-ranking people who had done very well by the billions of dollars the United States had poured into that country in terms of military hardware and other things. George C. Marshall's. This is one of the reasons that McCarthy attacked Marshall. Marshall spent 6 months in China trying at the request of the president, at the request of Harry Truman. He'd retired. He said, George, I need you to sort this out for me. And he tried for 6 months, and he came back and he said, this is not going to work. And frankly, we probably ought to start cutting our losses, because if you bet on the nationalists, you're going to lose. So my and as I say, if you, for me, and I read this first time 40 years ago. You may know Vinegar Joe Stilwell. Okay, General Stilwell, one of the most colorful military leaders of World War II. He was the chief American advisor to Chiang Kai-shek throughout the war, until he was eventually forced out by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang said, either this guy goes or we stop fighting the Japanese. Not that they were really fighting that much, but and that was one of Stilwell's issues, that sort of thing. Stilwell, I think, called it very well, and also George Marshall. So now, and of course, what Korea did, Korea saved Chiang's life, because what did Truman do immediately? He put the 7th Fleet between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland, and it's been there ever since. And whether you know it or not, while officially your country is not committed to the defense of Taiwan, we have always left that ambiguous. We are committed to the peaceful reabsorption of Taiwan into China. I don't know whether President Xi is going to wait that long, that sort of thing. So and the NATO issue. Remember, Article 5 says an attack on anybody is an attack on everybody. The original core of NATO was just the Benelux countries, England, the United States, Germany, and France, not even Germany, France and Italy. It expanded during the Cold War to include Norway, but not Sweden and Finland, Denmark, eventually Portugal, and Greece and Turkey, who of course hate each other more than they hate the Russians, that sort of thing. And then after the collapse of the Soviet Union, what did NATO do? We told the Russians that you didn't have to worry, and then we immediately expanded NATO eastward. And this is what Putin was talking about. He said, I want ironclad guarantees that you are not going to admit Ukraine into NATO, because that would be a threat that we cannot permit. And yet Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are all members of NATO. You are committed to the defense of those countries today, whether you know it or not. As I said, we sometimes forget about the paranoia. Well, it's not really paranoia, it's deep-seated insecurity that has historical roots in the Russian character. And Putin's acting that out right now on the question of Ukraine and NATO. I'm sorry, kind of veered away from Chiang Kai-shek. That's what, but at least in NATO, this is NATO, we have written commitments to defend those territories. We don't have one with Taiwan, and that's deliberate. But every once in a while, George W. Bush did it, and actually Biden slipped and did it the other day, a few weeks ago. Basically, we will come to their aid. Well, is Taiwan really worth it? Is Estonia really worth it? That's part of the question. The concept behind NATO was, people used to say, was to keep the Americans in Europe, the defense of Europe, keep the Russians out of Europe, at least Western Europe, and then under their breath they would say, and keep the Germans down. Like I say, but yeah, after only 10 years, we now have a German army, because NATO makes no sense without a German army. its core. The United States would never station enough conventional forces in Europe. No, we would never, American people would never stand for that. And so a German army is essential if NATO is to have any credibility. And in fact, there were those who argued that that was the whole point, and there shouldn't be. That the only thing holding the Russians back was the threat to go nuclear. And we'll talk about that on the 30th. Well, thank you all for coming again. I really,
Have you seen the movie The Death of Stalin?
no, I haven't, but
It's hilarious.
I know. I can't wait to see it, and I keep saying, I got to see this movie. I got to see this. Oh, okay. Well, I think I can stream it. My wife has all that stuff, Hulu and Netflix and all that crap, and I know it's on there somewhere. But I keep thinking, yeah, I got to do this. I got to do this. There's a minor personal story. I'm retired, right? But I'm home all day. I love to read. And that's what I'm doing. But my job, that one of my colleagues told me 30 years ago, the best thing about my job was they paid me to read. But now I really get to read, okay? And that's really, and I don't see any problem with that, except all the books I buy now I have to give to the library as soon as I'm finished, because my wife won't have any more books in the house. But I can't watch movies during the day. I feel like I'm wasting time. If I sit on my couch and watch a movie in the afternoon, it should be fine, but there's a little, guy marching around the back of my head that says, no, you're wasting time. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. And certainly be back next week for Dr. Laker and the other ones as well.